Before we get started today, we wanted to let you know that this episode includes conversations about violence against women, sexual assault, and substance abuse.
Maria Isabel Pinto Monteiro Alves was training for the New York City Marathon. She had moved to New York City from Rio de Janeiro. Like so many of us, she was searching for something new, something exciting. Every morning, it was reported she ran the same route around half of Central Park, finishing off with a swim in the pond. She would usually listen to music on her Walkman, but it was a rainy morning, so she didn't bring it along that day. Instead, she listened to her own breath. On September 17th, 1995, around 6 a.m., Maria Alves was murdered inside Central Park. My name is Vito Spano, and I was the commanding officer of the NYPD Cold Case Squad from 2001 to 2004. I was a member of the NYPD for over 22 years and have conducted thousands of criminal and thousands of death investigations. It's well known that the first 48 hours are critical in solving homicides. But that doesn't mean once that window's gone, we're out of luck. Some of them will never be solved. We have a suspect but can't find them, or we can't find evidence for conviction, or we just run out of leads. They're in purgatory. But in the Cold Case Squad, we breathe life back into these cases by any means necessary. This is Unfinished Justice inside the NYPD Cold Case Squad. This is the story of me and my former colleagues. We're the ones obsessed with solving homicides. The cases that otherwise would fade away and stay in the evidence room forever.
We're in the north central part of Central Park. Where we are right now is the underpass, the Huddlestone Bridge.
That's Joey Lombardi, an NYPD cold case detective.
I believe Maria was attacked either inside the underpass to the bridge or as soon as she exited. She was a West Side resident. She ran up Central Park West and entered the park and then came through here. You know, runners are creatures of habit. I mean, I don't know what path she had taken, just what time she had left her residence.
The doorman of Maria's West 56th Street apartment told police that she left at about 5:30 a.m. and then she never came back.
It may astound outsiders that anytime there's a murder or something like that occurs in a certain place, all the newspapers and all the televisions will all have the same crime. And it's because it checks all the boxes.
That's Philip Messing, a New York-raised journalist who's covered the city's law enforcement for almost 40 years. He's worked as a daily news reporter at the New York Post and as a TV reporter. He's a Brooklyn kid who is fascinated by how the city operates.
It was a crime of a young woman, a pretty woman, a foreigner, a woman who died violently and was sexually molested in the process, and a woman who died in a world-class cultural institution. It's a Sylvian little patch of land where it's supposed to be removed from any kind of crime or any kind of trouble. And the idea that she met this untimely end and was a mystery was just something that was very bedazzling for the people that chronicle such matters, you know? So naturally, it created a firestorm of publicity.
That publicity storm led to more than 300 tips in the first month alone. An NYPD task force of more than 50 detectives meticulously investigated each one. The team felt sure they'd be able to crack this case. But a lot of tips are dead ends. Some people call because a reward is being offered. And there are many, how shall I put this, nosy Nancys who always have something to say. But we have to investigate those tips anyway. And in this case, None of those hundreds of tips turned into anything solid. Months and months passed, and we couldn't catch the killer. Maria died on a rainy day and was found in a shallow stream, so DNA was hard to come by. She was badly beaten, but police never found a weapon. The case went cold. And then, more than a year later in 1996, it landed on the desks of the newly formed Cold Case Squad. But even we weren't having much luck. Meanwhile, the wait for answers was taking a toll on Maria's family. They were grieving from afar.
She left a lot of ripples. She left a lot of people who really missed her and loved her and for whom she was just completely irreplaceable.
That's Diana Jean Shima, a New Yorker who just moved to Rio de Janeiro to work as the New York Times bureau chief.
I had barely arrived, and the first I heard about it actually was from the desk in New York, calling and saying, there's been a murder in Central Park, and the victim is from Brazil and is from Rio.
Diana recalls the moment she was able to connect with Maria's family. Her mother was an immigrant from Portugal who settled in Brazil. She had 2 children, Maria and her brother, and raised them there.
And so very quickly I was speaking with the family before they came to New York. And the family was her mom and her brother and her sister-in-law. And they were obviously, very shocked and distraught over what had happened to her. They were used to sort of thinking of Brazil as, in a way, being less than. People go to New York for something. So they saw Brazil as like a third world country. They were used to sort of this like lawlessness, but New York represented something else to them, even though they were aware of dangers and that it would kind of take away their beloved sister-in-law, daughter was just unthinkable.
The case was gaining lots of attention in Brazil, and the family was planning to travel to the city to collect Maria's body.
They were not a wealthy family. Like, I think her brother worked as a mechanic, and her mom said she had $100 or $110 in her bank account. And how was she supposed to bring her daughter back?
It was tough, and Maria's family was starting to become overwhelmed by all the press, all the phone calls, and knocks on the door. They hadn't even seen Maria's body. Eventually, the family was able to get the money to fly to New York. Diana from the New York Times traveled on the same plane as the family. She sat a few aisles away to give them some space as Maria's mother and family were being hounded by reporters, desperate to talk to them.
A reporter had opened his newspaper to show his paper's coverage of the daughter's death, I guess to signal to her like, oh, I'm here. But of course, by then I had spent so much time with the family already that I was like recoiling from this, like, oh, this is like horrible. She kind of reacted by saying, well, he has a job to do. I respect that. You have to respect people's jobs. And I remember saying to the mom, who I really adored, you are quite a diplomat. And she said, I had to raise 2 kids on my own.
The situation as they reached New York City got a lot stranger. The family was put up in the fancy Regency Hotel on Park Avenue. If you haven't heard of it before, it's quite a grand, historic hotel that's been part of the city since the mid-1900s.
When we ended up in New York, I ended up having to interpret for Giuliani because he showed up for a meeting without an interpreter.
The mayor at the time, Rudy Giuliani, was on his way to meet the family.
And there was all of this security, like nobody can go in and out of the room. And then he shows up, but without any translator. So the mother wanted me in the room. He didn't want me in the room. He was like, we don't want any journalists in here. She says, no, I want her here. Nobody else was translating. So I just said, well, she's saying this. So he's saying, okay, why don't you just say and translate? So I ended up translating. And it was just like politics, like you just show up and you get all the photo thing and the pictures and whatever. And it was just one of those weird things.
Diana remembers how the family felt. Maria had been killed and they wanted answers. They were a patient family, but years turned into decades. It was hard for them to understand what was going on. They felt very forgotten, like New York had moved on.
Well, I think the first few years, people were constantly trying to figure out, do we know anything? And, every once in a while, there would be stuff in the paper, like, well, what happened? But I think at some point, there is this feeling like, well, we're not there, and do we really matter?
The original detectives on Maria's case struggled to solve it, but so did the cold case squad. For more than 20 years, there wasn't a lot of movement until the case got another look for an unexpected reason. More after the break. In the summer of 2016, the police department reopened the case, and it would land in the lap of this detective.
I'm third generation.
This is Joey Lombardi, who you heard earlier.
My grandfather was the commanding officer of Major K Squad in 1970.
And his father was a cop, too. Joey knows the ropes inside and out. Detective work is what he knows best. Why did we reopen the case in 2016? That's a question with a complicated answer. That year, a woman named Karina Vetrano was jogging and was murdered. Karina didn't die in Central Park, but something about the two women both being joggers struck some people as curious. Here's a New York Post headline from that August 2016. Jogger's slay rekindles anguish of eerily similar cold case. We at the NYPD were pretty sure that the cases weren't related. They were 20 years apart, and unfortunately, it isn't rare to have a woman be killed in this way. But when the New York Post makes a big deal of a story like this, the cold case squad gets asked to take another look. This is one of the ways cases get reopened. Renewed public attention. Philip Messing is the reporter who co-wrote that story.
I think that most reporters have pretty good memories for arcane coincidences. I don't know if I was the first one who remembered it or one of my colleagues did, but it didn't take long for people realized that the case in Queens bore some uncanny similarities to the Maria Alvarez case. And it naturally sparks speculation that you might have a serial killer at work. When this thing got a lot of ink, a lot of publicity, people said, hey, we have to go back into the old case as well.
But fresh eyes on the case, Joey Lombardi's eyes, did lead to new insights. He started going back through all the records.
There must have been about 15 boxes of files that I had to leaf through. Some of it wasn't important notes, but we call them DD5s, reports. Those are the most important pieces of paper that you have to read in a case. It's everything that everybody did in the past that you have to read.
Officers in cold case spent hours, days, and months, probably years looking at files. It's one of the most important aspects of our job. Is it boring? Maybe for you, but for us, it's where all of the clues are hidden. We love it.
Reading, writing, typing, phone calls, trying to find witnesses that were interviewed back then and locate them now was a very, very difficult task. There was only a few that we had located and spoke to that really weren't helpful to the case. It was just reading and realizing the patterns of events that happened in the case and the interviews that were done to put the pieces together. And then also working with the district attorney's office.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. What was the team doing? How is this possible to have literally no leads? They didn't have any DNA. Remember, it was raining on the day Maria was murdered, and her body was abandoned in a shallow stream. So collecting biological evidence was near impossible. Most of the tips went nowhere, but the detectives did have some that seemed like they might be solid. Those led the police to a man named Adolfo Martinez.
The day she's found murdered, he's also seen back at his residence, sweaty, hiding his clothes in a drop ceiling, and he also had given one of his roommates $5 with blood on it. But the guy that saw the money knew it was blood and gave it back to him. He wanted anything to do with this.
He agreed to have his blood, hair, and saliva tested. But as Maria's body was in the water, we couldn't get or find the perpetrator's DNA on her. And there was another problem. The tipster's story wasn't consistent, and neither was Martinez's.
And he had given admissions. He admitted that he did it, but then he changed his story and said he heard that somebody else did it. And then he said he was with another guy. So the DA's office at the time was, how do we believe him? He's changing his story. Nobody physically saw him do this. They found out that the one witness that called the tip in he flipped the script, we call it. He changed his story and said, I only called in a tip because it was a tip on me. It was totally shot out of the water.
The district attorney has to make sure we have enough evidence to indict someone. It's got to be a strong case. And the detectives didn't have any physical evidence. And these tipsters and the suspect kept changing their stories. Oh, there's another thing. The DA's office thought that they had good reason not to trust these guys. They were addicts.
Your witnesses are not credible, and you're not going to get enough. There's no physical evidence to trust a drug abuser and a felon. What's in it for them? Is there something they're trying to gain? Are they lying for their benefit? And it happens all the time.
Ultimately, back in 1995, the DA chose not to pursue a case against Martinez due to what we call unsubstantiated corroboration. They just didn't trust the witnesses. Of course, now we understand that substance abuse is a disease, not something you should dismiss people over. And so, 20 years later, when Joey and his team on the cold case squad looked back on it, they wondered if there was something to the idea that Martinez was involved. So the cold case detectives started going back to other people who knew him. And as it turns out, 3 witnesses gave detectives new information, and it all pointed to Martinez's guilt. Soon after the murder, Adolfo was seen returning home. His pants were soaking wet, and he had blood on his hands.
So there was witnesses that seen him come back, and there was one incident where he had given some guy some money, and it had blood on it.
He told one witness, about 3 hours before Alves was discovered, that a woman had been murdered in the park. And he told a witness that he had seen Alves jogging with her Walkman, and he wanted to steal it. He also told one of his friends, on more than one occasion, that he was involved in her murder. And a witness said he'd seen him hiding his clothes on the morning of Maria's death.
It was around the time after she was found in Central Park when he was found, or he was seen by his occupants, his roommates, whatever you want to call them.
There's another reason that it made sense that Martinez had committed the murder. To understand it, you have to understand some things about violence against women.
I think it's probably a more significant threat than we know.
That's Dawn Wilcox of Woman Count USA, an organization that tracks data on men who kill women in this country. I found that most women are killed by people they know, but when a woman is killed by a stranger, like Martinez, the cases are much more likely to go cold.
I think those obviously are the hardest to solve. So a lot of the cold cases we see end up being strangers.
So it all checked out. We finally had witnesses who could explain what happened, and the story fit the profile of a case like this. But there was one problem. While Joey was going over the original detective's notes, the ones that convinced him to take another look at Adolfo Martinez, well, he also found out that Adolfo Martinez was dead. Martinez passed away in 1997, 2 years after the murder of Maria Alves. Joey was convinced he had found the guilty man, but he couldn't arrest him. So Joey never got to question him to find out why he lashed out that day. All he can do is speculate from the original police reports.
I mean, just by reading the reports, I would say he was not of sound mind. He was a narcotics user. People snap, you know?
It wasn't the news we wanted to tell her family. We felt like we'd be able to catch someone and pull them in. Catch this guy we basically had in our grip. We almost had him, but he'd been dead for almost 20 years.
I'd gotten a DA on board, and I worked for about 8 or 9 months on it, put a synopsis together and presented it. And the DA went for it, and they said, yeah, he's the one who killed her.
That's right. You can move ahead with convicting a murderer, even when they're long gone. In this case, the squad had put together new evidence and persuaded the DA that Martinez was Maria's killer. Still, what convinced them this time around?
We did a lot of work on this by sifting through the case and trying to find witnesses. Could it have been the presentation now than back in 1995? I can't answer that question honestly, but the case was presented. They agreed that, yes, he most likely did do it. And that's how we were able to close it and give the mother closure. And that's the most important thing in these cases, the families. These people go without answers for decades. What do we have? What are we doing? What's next? I want closure.
The case was closed using exceptional clearance, a method we use to clear a case when an arrest is not possible.
You know, clearance rates are homicides in which police have identified a likely offender and have made a lawful arrest. An exceptionally cleared case is a case in which police have identified the likely offender, but for reasons beyond their control, they're unable to make the arrest.
That's John Bolahanis, professor in the Criminal Justice Department at Southeastern Louisiana University. He spent decades looking at homicidal exceptional clearance rates. And he says that exceptional clearance used to be more rare, but it's been used more often since a change in FBI policy in the 1980s. Now, more and more cases are being closed this way.
Historically, it was reserved for those extremely rare cases, those cases where either the offender is dead or the offender's in jail. However, in 1982, a specific category was established by the FBI called bar to prosecution. If law enforcement, however, believes that there is enough and they've exhausted all their investigative means, they can clear it under this bar to prosecution category. And it basically is as easy as filling out a form and having the desk sergeant sign it.
And to be honest, some people outside the force are pretty critical of the practice.
And so when you hear of a clearance rate, it's including all those exceptionally cleared cases as well. They don't normally disaggregate the data. And so it's a bit misleading. The clearance rates are exaggerated upward, I think, because of that. Clearance rates are a measure of police performance. And I don't think it would be that popular for them to really advertise what the exceptionally cleared rate is. Because obviously there are cases in which they're getting credit for, but the offender, for lack of a better term, got away with it. There's no arrest.
If Maria's killer had been alive, there likely would have been a trial. Her family might have had a chance to speak in court. The cops would have had the satisfaction of putting a killer behind bars. It's not ideal. Look, exceptional clearance isn't the ending anyone wants. But not ever knowing who committed a crime, it's worse.
And it's an affront to human decency that somebody is out there going about his life with impunity and not held to account for the crime, which is the devastation that murder causes is not just to the victim whose life has ended, it's to the family and to the people who knew him. And that's an incalculable toll on the social order.
Sometimes a person dies because a stranger covets their Walkman. But more often than not, when someone is murdered, the killer is someone they know. And we detectives need to sift through all the complicated dynamics of a person's life to figure out who it is. That's next time. Unfinished Justice, Inside the NYPD Cold Case Squad, is an Asterlight podcast. From Asterlight, our executive producers are Kathy Tankosik, Joe Paletto, and Sam Roseman. Our production partner is Neon Hum Media. Our lead producer is Crystal Genesis. Our associate producer is Liz Sanchez. Maura Walls edited this episode. The executive editor is Catherine St. Louis. Samantha Allison is our production manager. Original music by Asha Ivanovich. Sam Baer engineered this episode. Laura Bullard and Lori Siegel are our fact checkers.